Well, what a nice introduction and memories. I was at York University yesterday for the 30th anniversary of the Center for Research on Latin America and the Caribbean. A couple of people from that are here today. And that was very nostalgic, seeing people I hadn't seen for 5, 10, 20 years. And now Meta and I, we set a record, I think. I've been working on Mexico for probably half a century. First on the Mexican Revolution, and then on Mexican workers in the 30s. And I thought I was gradually working up towards working on the present, but I was doing it very, very slowly. And then NAFTA came, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And there was a flurry of conferences before NAFTA was made official, and shortly after, about the meaning of NAFTA. And as someone who works on Mexico, has lived in Canada 40-something years, and comes from the US, I view myself as a kind of, as continentally integrated. So NAFTA really propelled me into jumping into studying present-day Mexico much more. And at one of these conferences, I met a wonderful Mexican economist, trade union activist, Eduardo Velasco Arregui, who, and we started to work together. And that was over 20 years ago. And we have a variety of, well, not a variety, several unfinished books, and we finally finished one book. And what I'm going to talk about comes from really the first third of the book, which is about the corporate offensive in North America and how it's reshaped North America. Now, the fundamentals of the offensive are not unique to North America. They're what is often talked about as the neoliberal offensive. It's a transformation that's been going on all over the world. But we've studied it very specifically in terms of its North American expression. When I was at Berkeley at the time Meta and I were there was a lot of ferment, and there was a lot of debate about should you study the capitalist class and its power and what it's doing to reshape things, or should you study resistance? And I chose more to study resistance. Of course, you have to study the two together because they're part of the same processes, and that is the process of class relations or class struggle. But I focused on resistance. But then about 5 years ago, Ador and I were working on a book on the Mexican labor movement, Mexican working class. And then about 5 years ago, I gave a couple of talks in California to very sophisticated audiences, left sophisticated academics and old Marxists. And to my surprise, they knew very little about the first question that I posed when Meta asked me to pose questions. That is, who are the BRT, the BCNI, the CCC, and the I always forget the HN. And they knew this was in the US, so they knew vaguely about the Business Roundtable. Very few people knew about, and I don't think a lot of people know about, the Business Council on National Issues, which is called now what is it called now? The Canadian Council of Chief Executives. And very few people know about the Mexican Businessmen's Council, which is the smallest of the group, about 39 people. But these three organizations have tremendous power and influence, which I'm going to seek to demonstrate. The main argument of this talk is that there was a conscious class agency, there was a conscious agent, actors, people, in the historic transformation from various forms of welfare state and regulatory states to what we call neoliberalism, to an attack on the social net, on workers' rights, on public education, the public sphere, etc. These transformations did not happen because of the invisible hand of the market or because of some newer invisible hand called globalization, which forced people to transform their societies. Nor did they happen just as a result of the actions of policymakers and changes in thinking of economists in a new direction. The state did play a tremendous role in the transformation, and economists and intellectuals played a very important role. But we argue that the moving force behind this transformation was big business. And I'll describe that in some detail. But while these organizations, the Business Roundtable, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, the Council of Mexican Businessmen, which just changed its name to the Council of Mexican Business People, because now one of the 39 is a woman. So progress is slow, but anyway. They very deliberately try to keep a very low profile in the public, because they're very clear, their public relations advisors, US senators and others advise them, if people know you wrote this legislation, if people know you're behind this, they're going to think it's just some greedy effort of business. So stay in the background, write policy documents, we'll promote them. So they keep a low profile, and they're very, very conscious of this. And in our book, we talk about that because there's some wonderful quotes drawn from other books in which they talk about that very, very openly. But they're very proud of their achievements. So I urge you to go on their websites. They all have websites, and they're very slick websites. They can afford that. And they talk about all their tremendous accomplishments. That so much that has changed in the last 40 years has been a result of their far-sighted understandings of what's good for everybody. Not especially business, but that's not what they would say. I'm not suggesting anything conspiratorial. And I'm not suggesting there's some monolithic view, because there are debates within the capitalist class and within society. There are disagreements, but generally no longer on the issue of the contours of the neoliberal agenda. The state is too big, regulation is too heavy-handed, unions have too many rights, public sector is too inefficient, etc. The general mantra of neoliberalism has become a consensus under which the political parties of all three countries accept. They may not agree with some things at the edges, but they generally accept. Big business has been very successful in reshaping consciousness, and it has done this very consciously. When these organizations started, they realized how important think tanks were. And so just to give you one example from the US of the mushrooming of conservative think tanks, but liberal think tanks too operate under the same mantra. So if you look at the Woodrow Wilson Institute in Washington or the Brookings Institute, not right-wing institutes, their documents, their speakers, all are in the framework of neoliberalism, free trade, etc. It's not just the right wing, but it's really a consensus among political elites and the major parties of all three countries. So when you reach a certain age, you take off your glasses to read. When you're younger, you put them on to read. So just to give you an example, quoting from the book, conservative think tanks were created or expanded by support from different corporations, foundations, and the Business Roundtable. John Post, the executive director of the Business Roundtable, stated, "I can remember the early days of the American Enterprise Institute when chief executive officers didn't want to have anything to do with these goddamn professors. Now we understand more about the impact of ideas." The budget of the American Enterprise Institute, a very important conservative think tank in the US, which had been started in the 1960s, went from $1 million in 1970 to $10 million in 1980. In that same period, its staff increased from 19 to 135. It's still a thriving institute. This is...
What is the name of this book, please?
Oh, Continental Crucible, and I brought a few copies if anyone wants to part with $20. They're welcome. So, Big Business Workers and Unions in the Transformation of North America, Fernwood Press. Okay. Corporate lobbying, litigation, etc., created an ambience in which politicians felt they had to operate. The consciousness industry, this media, went along with that. And so, as probably all of you know, what is center now would have been considered to the right 40 years ago. I mean, President Nixon, not a flaming lefty, was more to the left on social issues, welfare issues, than Bill Clinton or Obama. Okay. The capitalist class in each of the NAFTA countries was upset in the 1960s and early 1970s, disturbed by developments going on in each of the three societies of North America. The black and student rebellions in the United States, as well as the rising militancy and wage gains being made by workers in the US. There was tremendous labor militancy in Canada in the 60s and 70s. And in Quebec, things were especially radical, not just with the separatist movement, but with the socialist, openly socialist programs of the labor movement. There were general strikes in Quebec. And even the Liberal Party had a left nationalist wing and had a serious economic flirtation with nationalism. The National Energy Policy and the Foreign Investment Review Act were maybe not very radical, but were very upsetting to Canadian big business as well as to US big business. And then in Mexico, you had the tremendous student rebellion of 1968 that was ended with a massacre, and a worker militancy, and then in 1982, a sudden nationalization of the banks, which had a galvanizing effect on the Mexican capitalist class, feeling that they had to get their act together. These anxieties about the weakening of class domination became more acute with the different financial crises, global and domestic, of the 70s and 80s. Business came to a consensus that labor needed to be squeezed and put in its place for both economic and political reasons. John Graney, who was head of the National Construction Association of the United States and then went on to be a top functionary of the Business Roundtable, said in 1968, "The deterioration of labor relations in our industry, construction, has progressed to the point that the very existence of the construction industry," a little hyperbole, "the very existence of the construction industry as a free enterprise is in jeopardy. In fact, its impact is so far-reaching that it poses a threat to our entire economic system." In each of the three NAFTA countries, there was always there were always important groups in business that never accepted the welfare state, the New Deal, union rights, etc. But there was an important section that were willing to live in some peace with the labor movement as long as they continued to control the work process, made good profits, they were able to share. But that shifted both with growing international competition and with the shift with workers making significant gains. And so the largest corporations in each of these countries formed these new associations that developed understandings and policies that have become the new common sense of the political elites, the media, and sectors of the population. The Business Council on National Issues was formed in 1976, later renamed the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. In the US, the new organization was called the Business Roundtable, formed a few years earlier, and providing the model adopted by the Business Council on National Issues in Canada. It was formed out of three groups that were also a fairly recent formation. The Labor Law Study Group, started by sections of big business to try to push through, to weaken union rights. The Construction Users Anti-Inflation Roundtable, which was big business not in the construction industry. And the March Group, which was a group of 40 top CEOs. These, the Construction Users Anti-Inflation Roundtable was very interesting because it decided that it had to smash the construction unions because they were making significant wage gains, and that was having a contagion effect, they felt, on workers in other industries. And so their conscious decision was, how do we break construction unions, break, either destroy or tame? And they carried out that policy very, very effectively. I don't have time to go into it in detail. Their main weapon initially was litigation. So they would, and one of them talks very openly to an author that I cite, about how they looked for small businessmen, because they didn't want to sue in their own name, they were from the top corporations. They looked for small businessmen who they would then finance their suing a union for whatever, this and that, to chop down the rights of unions and workers. In Mexico, in 1975, there was formed the the Business Coordinating Council, which encompasses thousands of organizations and even trade associations. But really, the group that formed it was this very elite group, the Mexican Council of Businessmen, 39 people, which has provided most of the funding, and almost all the presidents of the broader group have come from that. These organizations form the core of a much broader movement of capitalists aimed at transforming society in a neoliberal direction. And they used a lot of methods, litigation and propaganda, financing of TV shows. It's not totally clear, but they may have been involved in financing, promoting, okay, I blocked the name. What's the Marlon Brando movie, The Waterfront? On the Waterfront, as an anti-union movie. And they were very conscious of the need to reshape public opinion. It goes on still today. As you may know, I don't know if it was Bill Gates, but one of the big foundations trying to destroy public education in the US made an anti-union movie called Waiting for Superman, in which it's shown that seeks to show that it's the teachers' unions that are the big enemy of poor kids, racialized kids, etc., by trying to maintain union privilege. A similar group in Mexico, what is it called? I forget what it's called. has now made a similar movie. And both movies get very, very good distribution in commercial theaters because they're owned by people from the same class. The offensive of big business operates at a variety of levels. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about the North American Free Trade Agreement. But the most important trinational alliance is the one between these three peak organizations that I've been talking about. They now write, and you can find this on their websites, which is where I found this. They now write letters on a joint letterhead of these three organizations. The Business Roundtable, Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and the Canadian Business Association. The three names nicely on the letterhead, very nice letterhead. And they write to the President Obama, a letter to the three guys together, Obama, Peña Nieto of Mexico, and Harper here, saying, they're very happy with NAFTA, but it didn't go far enough. And so in this letter of, I think it was October 2013, they say, while praising what they see as, this is not a quote, while praising what they see as the success of NAFTA in making North America more competitive, they say that, nevertheless, quote, our companies continue to face obstacles to doing business across and I highlight this, within our borders. It's to transform class relations domestically. It's not fundamentally about trade. None of these agreements are. They call for regulatory downward harmonization. They use different language, greater efficiency, less red tape. And in fact, the model they cite for faster and more less burdensome regulations is the example of, guess what country of the three? We can be proud. It's Canada, as a model of deregulation. They also, promote Keystone Energy, the Keystone pipelines in their letters, and the approval of the hydrocarbon reserves agreement between Canada and Mexico and the Gulf of Mexico, a tremendously dangerous agreement in terms of the environment, but perhaps it won't go forward now with oil prices falling or be delayed. And they're not only proponents of a deeper North American integration, but also strong proponents of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which has been being carried out between a number of countries in great secrecy. We only know some things about it through leaks. And their ongoing assault on public services continues apace through, among other things, the underfunding and cutbacks that undermine public services, which then lends seeming credibility for privatization. They fight for lower taxes, and they've been very successful in lowering the tax rate. I think Lisa, as Sociology mentioned, the reduction from 47%
in 78 to 15% now.
From 47% in 78 to 15% now, the formal tax rate, corporate tax rate in Canada. Yeah.
Bank paid 7.5.
7.5. Okay. So they've been very successful in many of these things, and they've been successful in crushing private sector unions by playing off workers in one location against another, one country against another. NAFTA's been very important in that. And now their focus is on destroying public sector unions and turning the public sector into private profit streams. Everything from public education to health to water, you name it. The attack on teachers in all three countries is an attempt to remove obstacles to the privatization of education and downgrade the working conditions and wages of workers. And the line in all three countries, even though the education systems are very different in the three countries, especially Mexico, very different than the US and Canada, the line is the same. You blame the teachers, you cut back, You make it near impossible for teachers to educate kids. And then you say the teachers are the problem and the unions are the problems, the rigidities. If you're interested more in knowing about the attack and the attempt to privatize education, there's two wonderful books that I just recently read by Diane Ravitch on the US, who used to be an advocate of more charter schools and now has totally reversed her position and written two brilliant books about the tremendous money going into trying to privatize higher education in the US. Bill Gates, the Walton family, the owner of Walmart's, and another big foundation are pouring in millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to try to reshape the content and the process of education and destroy unions. They offer incentives, they offer money to school boards who carry out policies they advocate. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which followed by 5 years the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, was one step, albeit a crucial one, in a long-term strategy of class war that started in the 1970s and 80s, and then I've just described a bit. NAFTA didn't start the assault on workers. NAFTA helped constitutionalize it. The central purpose of the Free NAFTA agreement, which celebrated its 20th anniversary last January 1st, was the consolidation of neoliberal agendas, domestic agendas of big business in the three member countries. As well, it was to give foreign companies the same rights as national countries in the other countries. And it was also to tie the hands of governments to regulate companies so that if a company begins to operate, a private company in a country, and then you set up environmental standards that cost them a lot or force them to close down, or other standards, they're able to sue the governments for the loss of anticipated profits. I kid you not. The loss of anticipated profits. Would that it were that workers could sue when they get laid off for the loss of anticipated wages. But the loss of anticipated profits, not only can you sue for, you don't sue through the regular courts of the country. But special bodies have been set up of experts to adjudicate between supposedly sovereign governments and corporations. And this is one of the contentious things in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And for reasons that I'm not sure about, recently a colleague, Mel Watkins, was telling me that Germany was holding up the, not the Trans-Pacific Agreement, the European-Canada Agreement, because Germany didn't like that clause. And that Harper was fighting tooth and nail for that clause. A very important clause for businesses, very useful clause. By incorporating low-wage, low-rights Mexico into the continental production system, a process that was well underway before NAFTA, big business sought both to discourage labor militancy, the threat of relocation, to discourage labor militancy, as well as to harmonize costs and rights downward, not only in Canada and the United States, but also in Mexico, where many companies relocated from the central region, where there were more established, albeit very corrupt, unions, to the northern region, where unions don't exist or are totally paper unions. NAFTA sought to constitutionalize these domestic transformations by treaty, seeking them to make them near impossible to change. Ambassador Jaime Zabludovsky from Mexico, who was the coordinator of Mexico's negotiating team for NAFTA, put it, quote, "By consolidating the opening of its economy in an international treaty with its powerful neighbor, Mexico made economic reforms permanent, and thus extended the planning horizons for domestic and foreign investors. Similar things were said by the McDonald Commission. I won't read the quotes right now, I could read them, but in the McDonald Commission, they talk about how Canada's industrial policy is trade policy, and how in a country like Canada, you need something like NAFTA to get through these changes in domestic policy. And just quickly, some other points, and then maybe, how am I doing on time? I forgot to look at my...
We have 4:45, and you go another 15 minutes or so, and then we'll take a question.
Okay. So just briefly, the concept that the U.S., a very common concept in Canada and Mexico, that the U.S. imposed NAFTA on Mexico and Canada is very oversimplified and misleading. The initiative for the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement came from Canadian business. And the initiative for the NAFTA came from Mexico, though there was a long history of U.S. and Mexican companies working together promoting economic integration. And that played a role in pushing Mexico in that direction. But it wasn't simply imposed by the U.S. on these countries, it was imposed jointly on all three countries by the capitalist classes of all three countries in a very united way. So for example, the U.S. Congress under President Clinton, a Democratic president, a Democratic congressional majority, the U.S. Congress was balking and resisting passing NAFTA. And it looked at one moment that NAFTA would not be passed in spite of Clinton's wholehearted support for it. So meetings were organized between a team sent by President Clinton, whose hitman was, and he is a very direct, tough guy. His hitman was Rahm Emanuel, now mayor of Chicago, and they worked closely together with the Business Roundtable and the Mexican government to pressure Democratic congressmen to vote for NAFTA, because it looked like NAFTA was not going to pass. They didn't have the votes at first. The Mexican government poured in tens of millions of dollars, hired big US PR companies, hired important lobbyists to pressure Democratic congressmen to vote for it. And Bill Clinton pushed through the big business agenda of free trade, but it was a combined effort. It was a combined effort. This is not to deny that in some important ways, the US is the hegemonic power in the world because of its tremendous military power and the central role of the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury play in the world's economy. The US has special leverage on other countries, but it's wrong to see it as a simple imposition. The capitalists, I'll just make one more point. I didn't know if I was going to have time to go into this. Mexico, just a very quick comment. Mexico, the integration in the free trade agreement of a poor authoritarian state terrorist regime with two capitalist democracies with great stability, the integration of this introduces a wild card. There are very few human rights in Mexico, and it introduces a volatile dimension in the North American community. And that volatility is really bubbling, is coming close to a boiling point now. Whether it will boil over, it's hard to know, but the recent massacre or disappearance, because all the bodies have not been found yet, of 43 students studying to be teachers in a very poor area of rural Mexico, has galvanized opposition in Mexico to the regime and to the drug war. Because the drug war is really a war not of the state against the drug cartels, but a very complex war of different sectors of the state, of the army, of the police forces, that are intertwined in different ways with drug cartels. Because the drug cartels, unlike our big corporations, are not big monopolies. They were at one point. There were several big cartels that dominated Mexico, but they were broken up by some of the attacks on and arrests of the top people. And what you have now is a very complex war of many drug gangs fighting for control of plazas, places for shipment of drugs and so on, engaged in other kinds of crime too, and very intertwined with the police and the army in very complex ways. And so that kind of warfare is going on, but what's going on is that warfare is being used as a cover for the revival of a dirty war. In the 1970s, Mexico carried out a dirty war of assassination of many young people, of dissidents. Maybe 1,000, 2,000. There never was an end to the killing occasionally of dissidents. But in the 70s, there was a systematic campaign. That came about because in '68 there was student movement, big student movement, a massacre of the students. Some people felt the only way to fight back was guerrilla warfare. There was a growth of very powerful guerrilla groups in certain regions in the early '70s, and in response, the government carried out a dirty war. The dirty war was lessened, and I don't have time to go into. Mexico has gone through a number of changes. There was a liberalization of the political system, but the dirty war has been renewed in big time, because as Mexico engaged in neoliberal reform, as Mexico cut out the very limited social net, limited both in what it gave and limited to who it gave it to, as it cut that out, as subsidies to the poor agricultural sector were withdrawn as a precursor to NAFTA, as people could no longer survive on subsistence holdings that with a little production for the market, social discontent grew. And as social discontent grew, repression grew even stronger. And now Mexico today, in fact, in response to these killings, the killings happened about a month ago. Well, we don't know if, they haven't found most of the bodies. And there is some testimony that was given to a priest who's very involved in human rights. Some people claim they witnessed the student, I can't say it even, very horrific things. So in response to that, there's been a galvanization of student movements. And today, there's a national strike, student strike throughout Mexico. The main universities in Mexico City are closed down. The university that my comrade, Eudor Velasco, teaches at, a very big university with 5 locations in the surrounding Mexico City, is voted in big assemblies, big student assemblies, to close down for 2 days. So there's a tremendous bubbling, and it coincides with the student strike that started a few months ago at the second biggest university over demands about the neoliberal reform of university education. A strike that was independent of the massacre, and that the government has handled with kid gloves, very gently, because it's trying to manage to cool things down. It's also not coming up with any answers. So almost a month has gone by. It has supposedly all the best investigators investigating. The Army, the intelligence forces, the national police, they can't find the bodies. They've arrested hundreds of local cops. They've arrested soldiers. They can't find the bodies. You know, there were 6 bodies found because the bodies were right there. But what they've been uncovering is mass graves. Who's in the mass graves? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. You know, Amnesty International has called the investigations a farce. The general feeling is that they know what happened, and they just don't know how to handle it in terms of trying to not generate more protests. So, and how is Canada and Mexico? How is Canada and the U.S. very involved? The U.S. is very deeply involved in the militarization of the Mexican police forces and the preparation of the Mexican military for counterinsurgency. There's a Plan Mexico or Plan Merida, in which the U.S. gives a lot of millions in financial in military equipment to Mexico, and millions and a lot of training. And Canada is more involved than ever in Mexico, and Canada is getting a very bad reputation. Canada is no longer looked as the good guy in Mexico. People used to try to have backpacks, even if they were Americans, with the Canadian symbol on it. But now the Mexican mining companies are engaged in so many operations in different communities where there's a lot of resistance and a lot of repression. So we're all deeply, I mean, Canada and the US are very deeply involved. Okay, to go back, the main point that, you know, the last 2/3 of our book is about resistance and fighting back. And we've been accused by a couple of reviewers who wrote very generous, favorable reviews, but also said we were way too optimistic, which was a very shocking thing because we are not optimistic. It may reflect how pessimistic they are. But really, one thing that the Continental Offensive and that the North American Free Trade Agreement has done is it began to create, as it did for me, as it did for a number of people, it began to create links between Mexican, US, and Canadian unionists, Mexican and Canadian human rights activists. Now there's a very interesting network of anti-mining activists in Canada, Mexico, US, Latin America. And there's the beginning of trying to find ways to fight back continentally. And those ways of fighting back will have to somehow take into account the very, very different situation of Mexico, where people, when they struggle, risk their lives. And Canada, and the US, which while becoming more authoritarian, and if you're not Black or Latino and living in a ghetto, your life is not directly at risk. The very different is that we'll have to take into account ways of struggling together in spite of very different conditions. Thank you.